Sergeant Paul Greene thought he'd seen everything during his 15 years of military service, but nothing prepared him for what he found in that Colorado blizzard. A small boy, barely allied in the freezing wilderness, clutching military dog tags with shaking hands. The name etched into the metal made Paul's blood run cold. It was his own name, his own service number, his own blood type. But Paul had never lost his tags. They hung securely around his neck even now. The boy's whispered words would unravel a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of military command, and Paul would discover that some secrets are buried so deep that people will kill to keep them hidden. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The wind howled like a banshee across the Colorado Rockies, driving snow horizontally through the towering pines that lined the mountain trail. Sergeant Paul Greene pulled his winter coat tighter around his broad shoulders, squinting against the white fury that had transformed what should have been a peaceful weekend hike into a battle for survival. His German shepherd, Blitz, pressed close to his leg, the dog's thick coat already accumulating a layer of ice crystals that sparkled in the dim afternoon light. Paul had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, but this blizzard felt like nature's own version of warfare. He'd been hiking these mountains for years, using the solitude to decompress from his duties at Fort Carson, but he'd never encountered weather this severe. The storm had rolled in faster than the meteorologists predicted, catching him and Blitz miles from the nearest road. "Come on, boy!" Paul shouted over the wind, his breath forming white clouds that were immediately swept away. "We need to find shelter before this gets worse." Blitz's ears perked up suddenly, his head turning toward a cluster of boulders about 50 yards to their left. The dog's behavior shifted from resigned endurance to alert attention, his nose working the air despite the driving snow. Paul had learned to trust his partner's instincts completely during their years together, both in combat zones and civilian life. "What is it, Blitz? You smell something?" The German shepherd began moving toward the rocks, his powerful legs cutting through snow that was already knee-deep on Paul. The wind momentarily died down, and in that brief lull, Paul heard something that made his heart skip. It was faint, almost lost in the storm's renewed fury, but unmistakably human. A child's voice, weak and desperate. Paul broke into a run, his military training overriding his exhaustion. Blitz bounded ahead, barking now, his voice cutting through the wind like a beacon. As they rounded the largest boulder, Paul stopped dead in his tracks. Huddled against the rock face, barely visible beneath a thin layer of snow, was a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. His lips were blue with cold, his small body shaking violently, but his eyes were alert and fixed on something he held clutched in his frozen hands. The child wore only jeans and a thin jacket, completely inadequate for the brutal conditions. "Jesus Christ," Paul breathed, immediately dropping to his knees beside the boy. "Hey there, buddy. I'm Paul, and this is Blitz. We're going to get you out of here." The boy's eyes tracked to Paul's face, and with tremendous effort, he lifted his hands. Dangling from his fingers were 2 military dog tags, the metal catching what little light penetrated the storm. Paul reached for them instinctively, but as soon as he read the stamped information, his world tilted on its axis. Greene, Paul M. 12345, 6789, 15 JAN, 1985, BRC. Paul's own name, his own social security number, his own birth date and blood type. But that was impossible. His dog tags hung around his neck right now, safely tucked beneath his thermal shirt. He pulled them out with shaking hands, comparing the 2 sets. They were identical in every detail, down to the tiny scratches and wear marks that came from years of service. "Where did you get these?" Paul asked the boy, his voice barely audible over the wind. The child's lips moved, but no sound came out. Paul could see that hypothermia was setting in rapidly. Whatever mystery surrounded those dog tags would have to wait. The boy's survival took priority. Paul stripped off his heavy winter coat and wrapped it around the small body, then lifted the child easily in his strong arms. The boy weighed almost nothing, his small frame feeling fragile as bird bones. Blitz circled them both anxiously, sensing the urgency of the situation. "We're going to get you warm and safe," Paul promised, though he wasn't sure how. They were still miles from his truck, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. But 20 years of military experience had taught him that impossible situations required creative solutions. Paul remembered passing a small ranger station, about a mile back down the trail. It had looked abandoned, but even an unheated building would provide shelter from the wind. He adjusted his grip on the boy and began the treacherous journey back, following Blitz's confident lead through the white landscape. Every step was a struggle against the wind and deepening snow, but Paul's military conditioning served him well. He'd carried wounded soldiers across far more hostile terrain than this. The boy's breathing was shallow but steady, and occasionally Paul felt him stir slightly in his arms. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, the dim outline of the ranger station emerged from the swirling snow. The building was indeed abandoned, but the door was unlocked. Paul kicked it open and stumbled inside, grateful to escape the wind's relentless assault. The interior was sparse, but dry. A few chairs, an old desk, and most importantly, a small wood-burning stove in the corner. Paul gently laid the boy on an old couch, while Blitz shook the snow from his coat. The dog immediately went to work, using his body heat to warm the child's legs, while Paul searched for fuel for the stove. Fortune smiled on them. Someone had left a supply of split wood stacked beside the stove, along with matches and newspaper. Within minutes, Paul had a fire crackling, filling the small space with blessed warmth. The boy's violent shivering began to subside, as feeling returned to his extremities. Paul knelt beside the couch, studying the child's face in the firelight. The boy had dark hair and brown eyes, with features that struck Paul as oddly familiar, though he couldn't place why. More disturbing were the old scars he noticed on the boy's arms and hands, faint white lines that spoke of past injuries. "Can you tell me your name?" Paul asked gently. The boy's eyes opened fully for the first time, focusing on Paul's face with an intensity that was unsettling in someone so young. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse but clear. "My name is David Greene." Paul felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Greene. The same last name as his own. The same last name on the dog tags the boy had been clutching. Coincidences like this didn't happen in real life. "David, where are your parents? How did you get out here in the storm?" The boy struggled to sit up, his small hands still clutching the duplicate dog tags. "I don't have parents, at least, not anymore. I was at the facility and there was an accident, a fire. I ran and I've been walking for days." "What facility? David, you need to tell me exactly what happened." David's eyes grew distant, as if he were seeing something far away and terrible. "The place where they made me. Where they made all of us. The doctors there, they had pictures of you on the walls. They said you were my father, but that you didn't know about me." Paul's mind reeled. Nothing the boy was saying made sense, but the sincerity in his young voice was unmistakable. This wasn't the fantasy of a confused child. This was something else entirely. "David, I need you to think carefully. What was this facility called? Where was it?" "I don't know the name. We weren't allowed to know things like that, but it was in the mountains, like here. There were lots of buildings, and fences, and men with guns. Dr. Reeves said I was special, that I was made from you." The phrase "made from you" sent ice through Paul's veins. During his military service, he'd heard whispers of classified genetic programs, experiments that pushed the boundaries of ethics and legality. He'd always dismissed them as conspiracy theories, but now? Paul pulled out his cell phone, hoping for a signal, but the storm was interfering with all communication. They were completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in this remote station with more questions than answers. Blitz suddenly raised his head from where he'd been resting beside David, his ears pricked forward in alert attention. A moment later, Paul heard what had caught the dog's attention, the distant sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm. "Someone's coming," Paul said, moving to the window. Through the swirling snow, he could make out the running lights of a military helicopter circling the area. His first instinct was relief. Rescue was at hand. But something about David's terrified expression gave him pause. "No," the boy whispered, scrambling off the couch despite his weakness. "They found me. We have to hide. David. That's probably a search and rescue team. They're here to help. No, you don't understand. They're here to take me back, or to make sure I can't tell anyone what I know. The helicopter was landing now, its rotors whipping the snow into a frenzy around the station. Paul could see armed figures disembarking, their movements precise and military. But something felt wrong about the situation. Search and rescue teams didn't typically deploy in full combat gear. Paul made a split-second decision based on instincts honed by years of combat experience. If David was right, if these weren't rescuers but something more sinister, then they needed to disappear fast. Come on, he told David, scooping the boy up once again. We're going out the back. Paul kicked open the rear door of the station just as the front door exploded inward. Shouts filled the air behind them as Paul plunged into the storm, carrying David while Blitz ran ahead to scout their path. The snow that had been their enemy now became their ally, providing cover from their pursuers. Paul's military training took over completely. He used every technique he'd learned about evasion and escape, moving through the landscape like a ghost despite carrying the extra weight of the child. Behind them, he could hear the search teams spreading out, their voices carried on the wind. They reached a thick grove of pines about 200 yards from the station, and Paul set David down behind the largest tree. The boy was shivering again, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence beyond his years. Why are they after you? Paul demanded in a whisper. Because I know the truth about what they were doing. About what I am. About what you are. What do you mean, what I am? David looked at him with those unsettling brown eyes, so similar to his own. You were there, at the facility. Not you, but someone who looked exactly like you. They called him the original. They said I was made from his genetic material, that all of us were. The implications hit Paul like a freight train. If what David was saying was true, then somewhere there was a classified program creating children from the genetic material of active military personnel. Children who would grow up to be perfect soldiers, loyal to whoever controlled them. How many others like you were there? Dozens. All different ages, all from different originals. But something went wrong with the program. Some of us started getting sick, and others began asking questions they didn't want us to ask. A shout from nearby interrupted their conversation. The search teams were getting closer, their systematic sweep of the area tightening the net around their hiding spot. Paul could see the beams of powerful flashlights cutting through the snow, methodically checking every possible hiding place. Paul pulled David closer, feeling the boy's small body trembling against his chest. Whatever the truth was about this child's origins, he was just a scared kid who needed protection. Paul's soldier instincts screamed at him to keep David safe at all costs. Blitz appeared at Paul's elbow, having circled back from his reconnaissance. The dog's body language told Paul everything he needed to know. They were surrounded. The search teams had deployed with military precision, cutting off all obvious escape routes. But Paul had one advantage they might not expect. He knew these mountains better than anyone, having hiked every trail and explored every canyon during his years stationed at Fort Carson. There was a narrow ravine about 50 yards to their north, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but leading to a series of caves that few people knew existed. Paul whispered his plan to David, who nodded with remarkable composure for a child his age. They would move together, staying low and using the storm as cover. Blitz would range ahead, warning them of any obstacles or dangers. They began their careful movement through the pines, Paul's boots finding purchase on the icy ground, while David clung to his back. The search teams were thorough but predictable, following standard military search patterns that Paul had used himself in hostile territory. They reached the ravine undetected, and Paul helped David squeeze through the narrow opening first. The space was tight, barely wide enough for Paul's broad shoulders, but it provided complete concealment from anyone searching above. The ravine led to a series of limestone caves that extended deep into the mountain. Paul had explored them extensively during his off-duty hours, mapping their layout in his mind. The main cave was large enough to shelter them comfortably and had multiple exit routes if they needed to escape. Once they were safely inside the cave, Paul built a small fire using dried wood and debris he'd stored there during previous visits. The smoke would dissipate through cracks in the ceiling, invisible from outside. David huddled close to the flames, his young face gaunt with exhaustion and trauma. "Tell me everything," Paul said quietly. "Start from the beginning." David's story unfolded slowly, interrupted by periods of exhaustion and the occasional distant sound of search helicopters. According to the boy, he had been raised from infancy at a remote military facility, along with dozens of other children. They were told they were orphans being trained for special military service, but as they grew older, some began to realize the truth was far more sinister. The children were all products of genetic experimentation, created from the DNA of outstanding military personnel without their knowledge or consent. The program, code-named Operation Legacy, was designed to produce the perfect soldiers, children who would inherit the physical and mental capabilities of their genetic donors while being raised with absolute cracks. Loyalty to their handlers. "They showed us pictures of our originals," David explained, his young voice carrying an emotional weight that no child should bear. "They said it was so we could aspire to be like them. But I started to realize that some of the other kids looked exactly like their originals did at the same age. We weren't just made from them, we were copies." Paul felt sick. The ethical implications were staggering. If the program was real, it represented a violation of human rights on an unprecedented scale. But more personally, it meant that his genetic material had been stolen and used to create a child without his knowledge or consent. How did you escape? There was an explosion in one of the labs. Some kind of accident with the equipment they used for the genetic work. In the confusion, several of us managed to get out. I don't know what happened to the bindass. Others. David pulled the dog tags from his pocket, studying them in the firelight. "I took these from Dr. Reeves' office before I ran. I thought if I could find you, if I could prove what they did, maybe someone would believe me." Paul examined the tags again, noting details he'd missed before. The metal was slightly different from his own, with a subtle discoloration that suggested they were manufactured at a different time or facility. But the information was identical down to the smallest detail. "David, do you remember anything else about the facility? Any names, locations, anything that might help us find it?" The boy thought for a long moment. "There was a man who visited sometimes. The other doctors were afraid of him. They called him Colonel Barrett. He wore a uniform but no name tag, and he always came in a black helicopter." Paul's blood ran cold. He knew Colonel Barrett, or at least knew of him. Barrett was a shadowy figure in military intelligence, rumored to be involved in the most classified and controversial programs the Pentagon ran. If Barrett was connected to Operation Legacy, then this conspiracy reached the highest levels of military command. Outside the cave, the storm continued to rage, but Paul could no longer hear the search helicopters. Either they had given up temporarily, or they were regrouping for a more systematic approach. Either way, Paul and David had bought themselves some time to plan their next move. Paul used his satellite communicator, a piece of military equipment he'd kept after his last deployment, to send an encrypted message to the one person he trusted completely, his former commanding officer, General Patricia Hayes. If anyone could help them navigate this situation, it was Hayes. She had always been a straight shooter who put the welfare of her soldiers above political considerations. The reply came back within an hour. "Meet me at the old fire tower on Mount Evans tomorrow at noon. Come alone, but bring proof. Trust no one else." Paul showed the message to David, who read it with the serious expression of someone far older than his years. "Do you think she can help us?" "I don't know, but she's our best shot. General Hayes has always done right by her soldiers. If there's anyone who would want to stop something like Operation Legacy, it's her." They spent the night in the cave, taking turns sleeping while the other kept watch. Paul found himself studying David's face in the dying firelight, looking for similarities between them. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, the way the boy held his head when he was thinking. Morning brought clearer skies, but brutally cold temperatures. Paul knew they would have to move carefully. The search teams would be out in force now that visibility had improved. But Mount Evans was only a few miles away, and Paul knew routes through the wilderness that would keep them hidden from aerial surveillance. They made their way through the forest like ghosts. Paul's military training and David's surprisingly well-developed survival instincts, keeping them invisible to their pursuers. Blitz ranged ahead, his keen senses alerting them to any potential threats. The old fire tower stood on a rocky outcrop near the summit of Mount Evans, its rusted metal framework a testament to an earlier era of forest management. Paul had chosen it as a meeting point because it offered excellent visibility in all directions while having multiple escape routes. General Hayes was waiting for them when they arrived, her gray hair whipping in the mountain wind. She looked older than Paul remembered, the years of military service having etched deep lines around her eyes. But her bearing was still ramrod straight, and her gaze was as sharp as ever. "Paul," she said simply, then looked down at David with obvious curiosity. "And this must be the boy." Paul had included basic details about David in his encrypted message, but seeing the child in person clearly had an impact on the general. Her professional composure cracked slightly as she took in David's young face, an obvious resemblance to Paul. "Ma'am, I need to know how deep this goes. Is Operation Legacy real?" General Hayes was quiet for a long moment, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of surveillance. "Paul, there are things happening in our military that I don't like, programs that push ethical boundaries in the name of national security. I've heard whispers about genetic experimentation, but I've never had proof." She knelt down to David's eye level. "Son, I need you to tell me everything you remember about this facility. Every detail, no matter how small." David's account was even more detailed than what he'd told Paul. He described the layout of the buildings, the routines of the staff, the other children he'd lived with. Most disturbing were his descriptions of the medical procedures they'd all undergone, regular blood draws, psychological testing, and physical conditioning that went far beyond normal military training. "They said we were being prepared for special service," David explained. "That we would serve our country in ways that regular soldiers couldn't. But some of the older kids started to figure out that we weren't normal children. We were too similar to each other, and we all had abilities that regular kids don't have." "What kind of abilities?" General Hayes asked. David glanced at Paul, as if asking permission to continue. "We could learn things faster than normal. Physical skills, languages, tactical thinking. And we all had perfect memories. I can remember everything that's ever happened to me. Every conversation, every face." Paul felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If Operation Legacy had succeeded in creating genetically enhanced children with superior learning abilities and perfect recall, the implications for future warfare were staggering. General Hayes stood up slowly, her face grim. "Paul, if what this boy is telling us is true, then we're dealing with something that goes beyond military protocol. This is a violation of every ethical standard our armed forces are supposed to uphold. Ma'am, what do you recommend?" "We need more evidence. David's testimony is compelling, but we need physical proof of the facility's existence. Documents, photographs, something that can't be dismissed as the imagination of a traumatized child." David reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device that Paul hadn't noticed before. It looked like a modified USB drive, with additional circuitry attached to its housing. "I took this from Dr. Reeves' computer before I ran. I don't know what's on it, but I saw him using it to access files that he kept separate from the main system." General Hayes examined the device carefully. "This looks like it might contain encrypted data. We'll need specialized equipment to access it safely." She looked up at Paul. "There's a secure facility at Peterson Air Force Base where we can analyze this properly, but getting there without being detected will be challenging." As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the mountains. Paul could see multiple aircraft approaching from different directions, their flight paths designed to cut off any escape routes from the tower. "They found us," Paul said, his hand instinctively moving to the sidearm he'd carried throughout his military career. General Hayes' expression hardened. "Those aren't military aircraft. Look at the markings." Paul squinted at the approaching helicopters. She was right. They bore no standard military identification. Instead, they were painted in unmarked black, with no visible registration numbers. "Private contractors," General Hayes said grimly. "Someone is using mercenaries to clean up this mess." The helicopters were closing fast, and Paul could see armed figures rappelling from the lead aircraft. These weren't soldiers following military protocols. They were shooters with a specific mission. "General, we need to move now." Hayes was already leading them toward a narrow trail that led down the backside of the mountain. Her age might have slowed her reflexes, but her tactical thinking was as sharp as ever. She'd chosen this meeting point not just for its visibility, but for its multiple escape routes. They descended the rocky trail at a pace that bordered on reckless, loose stones skittering away under their feet. Behind them, Paul could hear shouted commands and the sound of pursuit. David kept up admirably, his young legs and enhanced physical conditioning serving him well in the treacherous terrain. Blitz bounded ahead of them, his four-legged agility allowing him to navigate the steep path with ease. The dog's presence was reassuring. His keen senses would alert them to any ambushes or obstacles ahead. They reached a cluster of boulders about halfway down the mountain, and General Hayes called for a brief halt. All three of them were breathing heavily from the rapid descent, but they were still well ahead of their pursuers. "Paul, I'm going to split off here," Hayes said, breathing hard. "I'll lead them away while you get David to safety." "Ma'am, I can't let you do that." "That's an order, Sergeant. This boy is our only witness to what happened at that facility. Getting him to safety is the mission now." Paul knew better than to argue with General Hayes when she used that tone of voice. But leaving her behind felt like abandonment of the worst kind. Hayes seemed to read his thoughts. "I've been in tighter spots than this, soldier. Take care of the boy, and get that data device to someone who can decrypt it. That's our smoking gun." She squeezed David's shoulder gently. "You're a brave kid. Make sure the world knows what they did to you and the others." With that, General Hayes disappeared into the rocks, moving with the stealth and determination that had made her one of the most respected officers in the military. Paul could hear her creating noise and distraction, drawing the pursuit away from their position. Paul and David continued their descent, following a game trail that led toward the valley floor. Paul's mind was racing, trying to formulate a plan for getting them to safety. Peterson Air Force Base was their ultimate destination, but first they had to survive the next few hours. They reached the bottom of the mountain as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and pink. Paul could see a small town in the distance, its lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. "We need transportation," Paul told David. "And we need to stay off the main roads." They made their way toward the town, keeping to the tree line and avoiding open areas where they might be spotted from the air. Paul's military training in evasion and escape was serving them well, but he knew their pursuers were equally well-trained and probably better equipped. The town was small and quiet, the kind of place where strangers would be noticed immediately. Paul needed to find a way to get them transportation without drawing attention. As they skirted the outskirts, he spotted an old pickup truck parked behind a gas station, its keys hanging from the ignition. Paul hesitated. Stealing a vehicle went against every moral principle he held, but David's safety took priority over his personal ethics. He would make sure the truck was returned, and any damages compensated once this was over. The truck started on the second try, its engine coughing to life in the cold air. Paul kept the headlights off as they drove through the back streets of the town, hoping to avoid notice. David sat quietly in the passenger seat, his young face serious as he stared out at the passing landscape. "Are you okay?" Paul asked. David nodded, but Paul could see the strain of the last few days taking its toll. The boy was exhausted, traumatized, and far from any semblance of normal childhood. Whatever happened next, Paul was determined to make sure David got the help and protection he deserved. They drove through the night, taking back roads and avoiding major highways. Paul's knowledge of Colorado's geography served them well, allowing him to plot a route that stayed well away from likely surveillance points. The truck's radio crackled with occasional traffic, but nothing that suggested they were being actively pursued. As dawn broke over the eastern plains, they could see the lights of Colorado Springs in the distance. Peterson Air Force Base lay just beyond the city, but Paul knew the last few miles would be the most dangerous. Military bases were equipped with sophisticated surveillance systems, and approaching one while being hunted by unknown forces was extremely risky. Paul pulled over at a truck stop outside the city to refuel and plan their final approach. While he pumped gas, David studied a map he'd found in the truck's glove compartment. "There's a service road that runs along the eastern edge of the base," David observed, his finger tracing the route. It looks like it connects to the main entrance, but from a different direction. Paul was continually amazed by the boy's tactical thinking. David's observations were astute and showed a level of strategic understanding that was remarkable for his age. The genetic enhancements that had been forced upon him were clearly more extensive than Paul had initially realized. They ate a quick breakfast at the truck stop diner, Paul keeping watch for any signs of surveillance while David devoured pancakes with the appetite of a growing boy. Several truckers glanced at them curiously, but no one seemed to recognize them or take special interest. As they prepared to leave, David suddenly grabbed Paul's arm. "That man at the counter, he's been watching us." Paul glanced casually toward the diner counter and saw a middle-aged man in civilian clothes nursing a cup of coffee. The man's clothing and bearing suggested military background, and he was indeed paying subtle attention to their table. "We need to go," Paul said quietly. They left the diner as naturally as possible, but Paul could feel the man's eyes following them. As they reached the truck, Paul heard footsteps behind them. "Excuse me," a voice called out. Paul turned to see the man from the diner approaching, his hands visible and empty, but his posture suggesting he was armed. "You're Paul Greene," the man said. It wasn't a question. Paul's hand moved instinctively toward his concealed weapon, but the man held up a hand in a peaceful gesture. "Easy, Sergeant, I'm on your side. General Hayes sent me." Paul studied the man's face, looking for any sign of deception. "Prove it." The man pulled out a military ID that identified him as Major Robert Chen, Air Force Intelligence. "The general told me to tell you that the Eagle flies at midnight." Paul relaxed slightly. The phrase was a code that General Hayes had used during their deployment in Afghanistan, known only to her inner circle of trusted officers. "Major, what's the situation?" "Complicated. General Hayes is alive, but she's in custody. The people behind Operation Legacy have more reach than we initially realized. They've got assets inside multiple agencies." Paul felt his heart sink. If General Hayes had been captured, then their chances of exposing the conspiracy had just gotten much more difficult. Major Chen continued. "But she managed to get word to a few of us before they grabbed her. There are still people in the system who want to see this thing exposed." "What do you need from us?" Chen looked at David with obvious sympathy. "We need that data device, and we need the boy's testimony. But first, we need to get you both somewhere safe." Paul weighed their options quickly. They were running out of allies and safe havens, but Major Chen seemed legitimate. The code phrase, and his knowledge of their situation, suggested he was genuinely trying to help. "Where do you want to take us?" "There's a secure facility at NORAD that's outside the reach of whoever is behind this. It's the one place they can't touch without raising too many questions." NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, built deep inside Cheyenne Mountain. It was indeed one of the most secure facilities in North America, and its independence from normal military command structure made it a logical choice for hiding from a conspiracy that might reach the highest levels of government. They transferred to Chen's vehicle, a nondescript sedan with government plates. Paul kept Blitz close, the dog's presence providing emotional comfort as much as security. David sat quietly in the back seat, still clutching the data device that might hold the key to exposing Operation Legacy. The drive to Cheyenne Mountain took less than an hour, but it felt like an eternity. Paul found himself constantly checking the mirrors for signs of pursuit, his paranoia heightened by the knowledge that they were being hunted by people with unlimited resources and no apparent ethical constraints. The entrance to NORAD was even more impressive than Paul had imagined. Multiple security checkpoints, armed guards, and blast doors that could withstand a nuclear attack. If they were going to be safe anywhere, it would be here. Major Chen's credentials got them through the preliminary security, but the process of entering the mountain complex was still lengthy and thorough. David submitted to the security screening with remarkable patience, though Paul could see the stress taking its toll on the boy's young face. Once inside the mountain, they were escorted to a conference room deep within the complex. The walls were lined with communications equipment and computer terminals, suggesting this was a facility designed for intelligence analysis and coordination. Waiting for them was a woman Paul didn't recognize, a civilian in her 50s with steel-gray hair and sharp blue eyes. She introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Martinez, a geneticist with the Centers for Disease Control, who had been investigating reports of illegal human experimentation. "Gentlemen," Dr. Martinez said, "we have a lot to discuss. But first, I need to examine that data device and get David's complete medical history." She looked at David with the compassionate expression of someone who had worked with traumatized children before. "David, I know this has been terrifying for you. But you're safe now, and we're going to make sure the people who did this to you are held accountable." David handed over the data device without hesitation, his trust in adults clearly conditional but willing to extend it to Dr. Martinez. Paul found himself impressed once again by the boy's maturity and judgment. Dr. Martinez connected the device to a specialized computer system designed for analyzing encrypted data. The decryption process would take time, but preliminary scans suggested the device contained extensive files related to genetic experimentation and child development. While the computers worked, Dr. Martinez conducted a thorough interview with David about his experiences at the facility. Her questions were gentle but comprehensive, designed to extract every detail that might be useful for building a case against Operation Legacy. David's answers painted a picture of systematic abuse disguised as scientific research. Children as young as 3 or 4, subjected to genetic modification, psychological conditioning, and physical training that bordered on torture. All of it justified by the goal of creating superior soldiers for future conflicts. "How many children were at the facility when you escaped?" Dr. Martinez asked. "Maybe 60 or 70, but they were always bringing in new ones and taking others away. I don't know what happened to the ones who left." Paul felt sick imagining the scope of the program. If David's estimates were accurate, then hundreds of children might have been subjected to these experiments over the years. The computer chimed, indicating that the initial decryption was complete. Dr. Martinez pulled up the files on her screen, her expression growing more horrified with each document she opened. "This is worse than I imagined," she said quietly. "They weren't just experimenting on children. They were creating an entire generation of genetically modified soldiers, and the program is much larger than one facility." She turned the screen so Paul could see the files. Maps showing facilities in multiple states, personnel records for hundreds of staff members, and most disturbing of all, genetic profiles for dozens of military personnel whose DNA had been harvested without their knowledge. Paul's own profile was there, along with detailed information about his military service, psychological evaluations, and even personal relationships. Seeing his private life laid out in clinical detail felt like a violation of the deepest kind. "They've been watching you for years," Dr. Martinez explained. "Ever since you were identified as a candidate for the program. Your genetic markers, psychological profile, and military performance made you an ideal subject for replication." David looked up at Paul with those eerily familiar brown eyes. "They showed us videos of you in combat. They said we needed to study how you moved, how you thought, so we could be just like you." Paul felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The idea that his most personal moments, his actions in life-or-death situations, had been studied and analyzed to create child soldiers was almost too much to process. Dr. Martinez continued scrolling through the files, her face growing paler with each revelation. "According to these documents, Operation Legacy has been active for over 15 years. They've created children from the genetic material of over 200 military personnel, all without consent. Where are the other facilities?" Paul asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Montana, Nevada, Alaska, and apparently one offshore facility in the Pacific. This is a massive operation with funding that goes through multiple black-budget programs." Major Chen, who had been monitoring communications equipment in the quarter, suddenly straightened. "We have a problem. I'm picking up radio chatter suggesting that our location has been compromised." Paul's military instincts kicked in immediately. "How long do we have?" "Unknown, but they're mobilizing significant resources. Multiple helicopter units and ground teams are being directed toward Cheyenne Mountain." Dr. Martinez was frantically copying files from the data device onto secure servers. "I need 10 more minutes to finish downloading everything." "We might not have 10 minutes, Paul replied, moving to the room's communications console. The security feeds from outside the mountain showed normal activity, But Paul had learned not to trust appearances when dealing with Operation Legacy. David stood up from his chair, his young face set with determination that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. If they're coming for me, maybe I should just go with them. I don't want anyone else to get hurt because of me. Absolutely not, Paul said firmly. We don't abandon our people, and that includes you. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded bravely. Paul realized that despite his genetic enhancements and advanced training, David was still a child who had been through more trauma than most adults could handle. Blitz suddenly raised his head from where he'd been resting. His ears pricked forward in alert attention. The dog's keen senses had detected something that the humans had missed. Major Chin was monitoring multiple communication channels now, his expression growing more concerned by the minute. They're not just sending a retrieval team. This looks like a full-scale assault force. On NORAD? Paul couldn't believe what he was hearing. That would be an act of war. Not if they can make it look like something else. A terrorist attack. A training accident. There are ways to spin this. Dr. Martinez finished her download and began destroying the original data device. I've got everything uploaded to secure servers at the CDC and FBI. Even if they stop us here, the evidence will survive. Paul was already formulating an escape plan. NORAD had multiple emergency exits, and his military experience had taught him that even the most secure facilities had vulnerabilities if you knew where to look. Major, what's the status of the blast doors? Still sealed, but if they have inside help, those won't stop them for long. Paul looked around the room, taking inventory of their resources. They had limited weapons, no body armor, and a child to protect. But they also had the advantage of knowing the mountain's layout and the element of surprise. Dr. Martinez, is there another way out of this section? There's a maintenance tunnel that leads to the vehicle bay. It's not on the standard facility maps. Show us. She led them through a concealed door behind one of the equipment racks. The maintenance tunnel was narrow and poorly lit, but it provided concealment from anyone searching the main corridors. As they moved through the tunnel, Paul could hear the distant sound of alarms beginning to echo through the mountain complex. Whatever was happening outside, it was big enough to trigger NORAD emergency protocols. They reached the vehicle bay to find it in chaos. Military personnel were responding to multiple alerts, and Paul could see on the security monitors that helicopters were indeed approaching the mountain. Major Chin grabbed Paul's arm. Those aren't standard military aircraft. Look at the formation, the approach pattern. This is a private military contractor. Paul studied the monitors and had to agree. The approaching aircraft were flying in patterns designed for assault rather than standard military operations. Someone had hired mercenaries to attack one of America's most secure military installations. We need to get out of here before they lock down the entire complex, Paul said. Dr. Martinez led them to a service elevator that would take them to one of the emergency exits. As they rode up through the mountain, Paul tried to process everything they had learned. Operation Legacy was larger and more dangerous than anyone had imagined, with resources that seemed almost unlimited. The elevator opened onto a small chamber carved into the rock face of Cheyenne Mountain. Through a heavily reinforced door, Paul could see the Colorado landscape stretching out below them. This was one of NORAD's most secret exits, designed for use only in the most extreme emergencies. Where does this lead? Paul asked. There's a service road about half a mile down the mountain. It connects to a network of old mining trails that most people don't know about. Paul looked at David, who was holding up remarkably well despite the stress and exhaustion. The boy's enhanced genetics were clearly providing him with physical resilience beyond that of a normal child, but Paul worried about the psychological toll all of this was taking. David, are you ready for another hike? The boy nodded without hesitation. I've been running for days. I can keep going. They exited through the concealed door and began their descent down the rocky slope. Behind them, Paul could see the approach lights of multiple helicopters converging on the main NORAD entrance. The attack was beginning in earnest. The service road was little more than a dirt track carved into the mountainside, but it provided a route away from the complex. Paul set a fast pace, knowing that they needed to put distance between themselves and NORAD before the assault teams realized their quarry had escaped. As they reached the junction with the mining trails, Paul's satellite communicator crackled to life. The voice that came through was General Hayes, and she sounded like she was in considerable pain. "Paul, can you hear me?" "General, we thought you were captured." "I was, but I managed to get away." "Paul, listen carefully. Barrett isn't just running Operation Legacy, he's planning something much bigger. The genetic program was just the beginning." Static interrupted the transmission, but Hayes' voice came back stronger. "They're planning to replace key military personnel with their genetically modified operatives. David and the other children were just the first generation. They've been growing adult clones for years." Paul felt the world tilt around him. If what General Hayes was saying was true, then Operation Legacy wasn't just about creating child soldiers. It was about infiltrating and eventually controlling the entire military hierarchy. "General, where are you?" "Safe for now, but not for long. Paul, you need to get David to the FBI facility in Denver. Agent Sarah Morrison is expecting you. She's one of the few people we can trust." The transmission cut out, leaving them in silence on the mountain trail. Paul looked at Major Chen, who had gone pale during the conversation. "Jesus Christ," Chen whispered. "If they've been creating adult clones of military personnel, how do we know who to trust?" It was a terrifying question with no good answer. If Operation Legacy had the capability to create perfect genetic duplicates of key military figures, then the conspiracy could reach anywhere in the government. David tugged on Paul's sleeve. "There's something else you need to know about the facility. They didn't just make children. I saw adults there too. People who looked exactly like some of the staff but acted differently." Paul's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, Doctor?" "Reeves had a twin, but they were never in the same place at the same time. And sometimes the guards would act like they didn't remember things that had happened the day before. We thought they were just being mean, but now I think they might have been different people." The implications were staggering. If Operation Legacy had already begun replacing key personnel with clones, then the conspiracy was further advanced than anyone had realized. They continued down the mountain trail. As darkness fell, using night vision equipment that Major Chen had brought from NORAD, the landscape was treacherous in the dark. But Paul's military training and David's enhanced abilities allowed them to maintain a good pace. Behind Akan and they could see the glow of fires and searchlights around Cheyenne Mountain. The battle for NORAD was apparently ongoing, though Paul couldn't tell who was winning. They reached the highway near Colorado Springs as dawn was breaking. Major Chen had arranged for a vehicle to be waiting at a pre-designated location, part of the escape plan that General Hayes had put in place. The drive to Denver took 3 hours, during which Paul tried to process everything they had learned. Operation Legacy was not just a rogue military program. It was a conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of American democracy. David slept fitfully in the back seat, his young body finally succumbing to exhaustion. Even in sleep, his face showed signs of the trauma he had endured. Paul found himself studying the boy's features again, marveling at the genetic similarity between them while mourning the childhood that had been stolen from him. The FBI facility in Denver was a nondescript office building that gave no indication of its true purpose. Agent Morrison was waiting for them in the parking garage. A woman in her 40s, with the sharp eyes and confident bearing of a seasoned investigator. "Gentlemen," she said without preamble, "we have a lot of work to do and very little time to do it." She led them through multiple security checkpoints to a secure conference room deep within the building. The walls were lined with evidence boards and computer terminals, suggesting that the FBI had been investigating Operation Legacy for some time. "How long have you known about this program?" Paul asked. "We've been tracking unusual activities at several facilities for the past 2 years. Missing military personnel, unexplained budget allocations, reports of children being trafficked to remote locations. But we never had a witness who could give us the inside story." She looked at David with obvious sympathy. "David, I know this has been incredibly difficult for you, but your testimony could help us save the other children and stop this program permanently." David straightened in his chair, showing the same determination that Paul had seen throughout their ordeal. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next several hours, David provided the most comprehensive account of Operation Legacy that anyone had yet assembled. Agent Morrison's questions were thorough but gentle, designed to extract every detail without re-traumatizing the boy. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than Paul had imagined. Operation Legacy was not just one program, but an entire network of related projects. Children were being created from the genetic material of outstanding military personnel, then raised and trained to become perfect soldiers. But the program had expanded to include adult clones who were being used to replace key figures in the military hierarchy. According to David's testimony, they have the capability to create genetic duplicates that are physically identical to the original, but psychologically conditioned to be completely loyal to the program's handlers. Agent Morrison explained. How many people could they have replaced? Major Chan asked. We don't know for certain, but based on the facility records that Dr. Martinez recovered, potentially hundreds. They've been targeting personnel in key positions, people who would have access to classified information and decision-making authority. Paul felt sick. If the conspiracy had already infiltrated the military to that extent, then stopping it would be almost impossible through normal channels. Agent Morrison seemed to read his thoughts. That's why we're going to bypass normal channels entirely. We're taking this directly to a congressional committee that specializes in oversight of classified programs. They have the authority and the resources to shut down Operation Legacy permanently. But first, they needed more evidence. David's testimony was compelling, but they needed physical proof of the facilities and the cloning program. The data device had provided extensive documentation, but Congress would want to see the actual sites where the crimes had been committed. We need to find one of the active facilities, Agent Morrison said, preferably one where we can document the presence of both children and adult clones. David studied the maps that Dr. Martinez had recovered from the data device. The facility in Montana was the largest. That's where they did most of the adult work. If we could get inside there. Absolutely not, Paul said immediately. I'm not putting you at risk again. But I know the layout, the security procedures, the daily routines. Without me, you'd be going in blind. Agent Morrison looked at Paul seriously. He's right. David's knowledge of the facilities is our biggest advantage. But we can minimize his exposure by using him primarily for intelligence, rather than direct infiltration. Paul didn't like it, but he could see the logic. They needed to move fast before Operation Legacy could shut down and relocate their operations. David's inside. Knowledge could make the difference between success and failure. The Montana facility was located in a remote valley in the Glacier National Park area, disguised as a private research station. According to the files, it housed both children and adults, making it the perfect target for gathering comprehensive evidence. They flew to Montana in an FBI aircraft, accompanied by a team of federal agents and military investigators. Paul insisted on going along despite Agent Morrison's objections. After everything they had been through together, he wasn't about to abandon David now. The approach to the facility required careful planning. It was heavily guarded and equipped with keen, sophisticated surveillance systems. But David's knowledge of the internal layout and security procedures gave them crucial advantages. The shift change happens at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, David explained as they studied aerial photographs of the complex. That's when security is most relaxed, because the guards are focused on transition procedures. The plan was to infiltrate during the morning shift change, gather photographic and video evidence of the cloning operations, and extract before the evening security briefing when their presence would be most likely to be detected. Paul found himself amazed once again by David's tactical thinking. The boy's observations about guard rotations, surveillance blind spots, and facility routines showed a level of strategic understanding that would have impressed seasoned military officers. They approached the facility at dawn, using the mountainous terrain to mask their presence from electronic surveillance. Paul, Agent Morrison, and 2 other agents would infiltrate the main buildings, while David remained with the support team, providing real-time intelligence about internal security. The facility was larger than Paul had expected, a complex of modern buildings nestled in the valley and connected by underground tunnels. From the outside, it looked like a legitimate research station, but David's descriptions of what lay inside painted a very different picture. They breached the perimeter fence at a location David had identified as having minimal sensor coverage. The morning mist provided additional concealment as they moved toward the main laboratory building. Inside, the facility was eerily quiet. The corridors were sterile and white, lined with doors that led to rooms Paul didn't want to imagine. Following David's directions through their radio link, they made their way toward the central laboratory, where the cloning operations took place. What they found there exceeded their worst fears. Rows of artificial wombs containing developing human embryos, computer terminals displaying genetic profiles of military personnel, and most disturbing of all, a series of chambers where adult clones were kept in suspended animation until needed. Agent Morrison documented everything with her camera, her professional composure barely containing her horror at what they were witnessing. Paul found himself staring at one of the suspended figures, a perfect duplicate of a colonel he had served under in Afghanistan. "Paul, we need to move," Agent Morrison whispered. "David says the morning briefing is starting early today." They gathered as much evidence as possible and began their withdrawal. But as they reached the main corridor, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Their presence had been detected. Security teams converged on their location from multiple directions. Paul's military training took over as he and the other agents fought their way toward the exit. The facility's guards were well-trained and heavily armed, but they seemed to be operating under orders to capture rather than kill. They reached the perimeter fence as helicopters began circling overhead. The extraction team was waiting with vehicles, but the escape route was about to be cut off by the incoming aircraft. Paul made a split-second decision that went against every tactical manual he'd ever studied. Instead of running for the vehicles, he led the team toward a rocky outcrop that would provide cover from aerial surveillance. "What are you doing?" Agent Morrison demanded. "Trust me," Paul replied, remembering something David had told him about the facility's layout. They reached the rocks just as the helicopters opened fire on their original position. The vehicles were destroyed in seconds, but Paul had led them to safety. According to David, there was an old mining tunnel system beneath the outcrop that connected to a road several miles away. They found the tunnel entrance exactly where David had said it would be. The boys' perfect memory and detailed knowledge of the area had saved their lives once again. The tunnel led to an abandoned mine shaft that emerged near a Forest Service road. A backup extraction team was waiting there, having been alerted by David when the primary plan fell apart. As they drove away from the facility, Paul looked back at the smoke rising from the valley. They had succeeded in gathering evidence of Operation Legacy's crimes, but the cost had been high. The facility would be shut down and relocated within hours, and any evidence they hadn't captured would be destroyed. But what they had documented would be enough. The photographs and video footage showed clear evidence of illegal human experimentation and cloning operations. Combined with David's testimony and the recovered data files, it painted a picture of conspiracy and abuse that no congressional committee could ignore. The hearing took place in a secure facility in Washington, D.C., with members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees in attendance. David testified via secure video link, his young voice clear and steady as he described the horrors he had witnessed and experienced. Paul watched from the witness waiting area as David answered questions with remarkable composure. The boy's enhanced memory allowed him to provide details about dates, names, and specific incidents that corroborated the documentary evidence they had gathered. When Paul's turn came to testify, he focused on the broader implications of what they had discovered. Operation Legacy wasn't just about creating child soldiers or even replacing military personnel with clones. It represented a fundamental threat to democratic institutions and the rule of law. Members of the committee, Paul concluded, what we're dealing with here is nothing less than an attempt to subvert our military and government through genetic manipulation and replacement of key personnel. If we don't act decisively to stop this program, we may find that the very people charged with protecting our democracy have been replaced by imposters loyal to those who created them." End quote. The committee's questions were sharp and pointed, reflecting both their horror at what they were learning and their determination to get to the bottom of the conspiracy. Agent Morrison presented the physical evidence methodically, each photograph and document building a case that was impossible to refute. Dr. Martinez testified about the genetic manipulation techniques that had been used, explaining how Operation Legacy represented a perversion of legitimate medical research. Her scientific expertise lent credibility to claims that might otherwise have seemed like science fiction. The most dramatic moment came when David was asked to demonstrate his enhanced abilities. His perfect recall allowed him to recite entire conversations from memory, complete with precise descriptions of facial expressions and body language. His physical capabilities, while limited by his young age, were clearly beyond those of a normal child. "David," the committee chairman asked gently, "what do you want to happen to the people who did this to you and the other children?" David was quiet for a long moment, his young face serious as he considered the question. "I want them to be stopped so they can't hurt anyone else. And I want the other kids to be found and helped. But mostly, I just want to have a normal life, if that's possible." The hearing concluded with a unanimous vote to immediately shut down all facilities associated with Operation Legacy and to launch a full investigation into the program's leadership and funding. Federal marshals were dispatched to arrest Colonel Barrett and other key figures, though many of them seemed to have disappeared as soon as news of the hearing leaked. Paul found himself appointed as David's temporary guardian, while the legal and bureaucratic machinery worked to determine the boy's future. It was a responsibility he accepted gladly, having grown deeply attached to the brave young man who had endured so much. They returned to Colorado, where Paul took extended leave from his military duties to help David adjust to normal life. It was a challenging process, as the boy's enhanced abilities and traumatic experiences made it difficult for him to relate to other children his age. But gradually, with the help of specialized counselors and therapists, David began to heal. He attended a private school that was equipped to handle gifted children, where teachers helped him learn to moderate his advanced capabilities so he could fit in with his peers. Paul marveled at David's resilience. Despite everything he had been through, the boy retained a fundamental optimism and curiosity about the world. His enhanced genetics had given him remarkable physical and mental capabilities, but it was his essential humanity that impressed Paul most. The other children from Operation Legacy were gradually located and rescued from facilities across the country. Some, like David, were able to adjust to normal life with help. Others required more intensive care, their psychological conditioning having been more severe. Colonel Barrett was eventually captured in South America, along with several other key figures in the conspiracy. The trials that followed revealed the full scope of Operation Legacy and led to significant reforms and oversight of classified military programs. Paul continued to serve in the military, but with a new appreciation for the ethical boundaries that separate legitimate national defense from the kind of abuse of power that Operation Legacy represented. His experience had taught him that vigilance against corruption and abuse was every soldier's duty, regardless of rank or position. David grew into a remarkable young man, his enhanced abilities channeled into pursuits that benefited society, rather than serve the interests of those who had created him. He became an advocate for other victims of illegal experimentation and worked to ensure that the horrors of Operation Legacy would never be repeated. Years later, as Paul watched David graduate from college with degrees in both genetics and law, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. A chance encounter in a Colorado blizzard had led to the exposure of one of the most disturbing conspiracies in American history. But more than that, it had created a bond between two people who had found family in the most unlikely circumstances. David had gained not just a guardian, but a father who loved him unconditionally. And Paul had discovered that sometimes the most important battles are fought not on foreign battlefields, but in defense of the innocent and vulnerable. The dog tags that David had clutched in the snow that day were displayed in a place of honor in their home, a reminder of how far they had both come and the price of the freedom they now enjoyed. They served as a symbol, not of the conspiracy that had created David, but of the courage and determination that had ultimately brought it to an end. Blitz, now an older but still devoted companion, often lay beside David as the young man studied or worked on his advocacy projects. The dog had been through the entire journey with them, a faithful friend whose loyalty had never wavered despite the dangers they had faced. On quiet evenings, Paul and David would sometimes talk about those harrowing days when everything had seemed hopeless. They would remember the people who had helped them, like General Hayes and Agent Morrison, who had risked everything to expose the truth. But mostly, they focused on the future. David's unique background and abilities positioned him to make significant contributions to society, and Paul took pride in watching him choose paths that honored both his enhanced capabilities and his essential humanity. The story of Operation Legacy served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of ethical oversight in scientific research. But for Paul and David, it was also a story of redemption, resilience, and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. As David prepared to begin law school, specializing in bioethics and human rights, Paul knew that the boy he had found dying in a Colorado blizzard had grown into a man who would spend his life ensuring that no covert other children would suffer as he had. The conspiracy that had created David was gone, destroyed by the courage of those who had refused to let evil triumph. But the family that had emerged from that darkness would endure, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest victories come not from warfare, but from the simple act of one person protecting another. In the end, the dawn tags in the snow had led not to destruction but to salvation, not to the triumph of those who would abuse power, but to the vindication of those who would stand against them. And in the small house in Colorado, a soldier and the boy who shared his genes but had earned the right to choose his own destiny, continued to build a life based on love, integrity, and hope for the future.